Hello Year 10 and welcome to your first lesson on the new topic of adaptations and ecosystems. This is Miss Orford, as you might have recognised my voice, and I hope you're all keeping really well and safe during this strange time. For this lesson you will need a piece of paper, minimum, preferably sort of like an exercise book or notepad that you can kind of keep all of these lessons with, together with, and a pen. You might want a different coloured pen so you can check your answers, and obviously you need your brain switched on. So once you've got all those things, we can continue. So our driving question today is, why do we need to put living things into groups? So we're actually going to be looking at the third keyword down there. It's called classification, and we're going to be looking at lots of different systems of how we classify organisms or living things, and basically why we need to do it, and compare some different ways of doing it, and then look at something called evolutionary trees, which are not units but with family trees. So once you've written your driving question and made a note of those 4 key words, we'll continue. So I want you to have a look at this picture and think to yourself, what is this? So lots of people might have different names, but I want you to think, maybe just note down the name that you recognise it as. So some names I thought of, and have actually had to Google a few because there's actually quite a few, are these ones. So most of you probably know it as daddy longlegs or cranefly, but there's lots of other names too. So the granddaddy longlegs, I'm not quite sure why the grand bit is needed. The long-legged spider, vibrating spider, and harvestman, and the shepherd spider as well. So which is the right one? Lots of you are probably thinking, oh, it's the one I thought of, obviously, but technically none of those is right, because those are all common names or sort of colloquial names that we all know this particular insect by, and actually its official name is, and I hope you're ready for this, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce it, is this. Luckily not all of it, just this last little bit here. So why on earth do we need this weird name? And if you think about it, if you were a scientist from, say, France, or even just somewhere in the UK different to Bristol, and you said, oh, I found a cranefly in my house, and the other scientist went, I don't know what a cranefly is, then, but he actually knows it as the harvestman spider, they might think, oh my goodness, there's a completely different type of species of insect in the Bristol area that I wasn't aware of. So we actually have this kind of universal language of how we name things, and the way we do it is to put things into groups that have similar features, and then they get broken down into these smaller subgroups. And the 2 smallest subgroups, which are known as the genus and species, and we'll look a little bit more at that in a minute, help create what we call this binomial name. So the binomial bit means bi, like a bicycle, it's got 2 parts, and then nomial just means name. So it's actually a Latin word. So every living organism on our planet has got a binomial name. So for example, you might know that humans are known as Homo sapiens. That's our binomial name. We've also got loads of different examples. And my favourite one is actually for a gorilla. It's actually just really easy. It's called gorilla. But what you might notice, if we just pop back to the previous slide a second, is that it's always in italics if it's typed, and it's got a capital letter for the first part. But if you're handwriting it, it's obviously quite hard to make it italics, so normally what we do is underline that name to show that it's its binomial name. So these groups initially start off as what we know as the 5 kingdoms. So every single living thing on our planet falls into one of 5 kingdoms. So you've got the animals, which it's kind of, because all of this is quite Latin based, I don't know if you recognise any of those words before, but we also might hear it be called animalia. So all multicellular organisms, including us, go into that group, and including that daddy longlegs or cranefly or whatever it is you knew it by. Then you've got the second group, which is plants or plantae in Latin. So anything that's green plant will fall into that group instead. You've then got group 3, which is for fungi or fungi, depending on how you want to pronounce it, which is your molds, your mushrooms, yeast falls into that as well. you've got the prokaryotes, which are things like bacteria in our fourth group, blue-green algae, so they can photosynthesize a little bit, those algae, but they're not completely plants because they're probably single-celled, that sort of thing, so that's why they're not in group 2, the plant group. And then you finally got group 5, which is Protoctista. I kind of call that my dump group, if you like. It's the one where if it doesn't really fit into any of the previous 4, it gets popped into that last group there. So things like amoeba or paramecium. Some of you maybe looked at amoeba under the microscope when you were in year 7. So once things have gone into one of those 5 kingdoms, or the 5 biggest groups, it gets broken down even further. So it gets grouped into smaller and smaller groups. So if you imagine something like the crane fly that we just looked at, or daddy long nose, whichever name you wanted for it, it goes into the Animalia kingdom, as I mentioned earlier, but then it's got this next subgroup, which is the phylum, and that's Arthropoda. Then you've got class, Arachnida, which implies it's a spider. I don't know if any of you linked arachnophobia with arachnida and spiders. Order, family, and then those last 2 smaller groups, the genus and the species, which then, as you can see, creates that binomial name. It's really important that you recognise this keyword at the species there. It's the smallest group of organisms that can exist. They need to be able to interbreed. As soon as they cannot interbreed, they are no longer the same species, and those they might be in the same genus but in a different species. And that'll make a little bit more sense when we look at future topics as well. So this system, where we break things down from kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, is known as the Linnaean System. This was a system that was developed by a scientist called Carl Linnaeus in around the 1750s, and it was all based on just looking and observing different animals and different plants and different living organisms, and just looking at their structures and characteristics and putting them together if they're similar. So if you look at the lion, it also falls into the animal kingdom. Its phylum is the chordata, so it's got a vertebrate, it's got a backbone, so it goes, anything that doesn't have a backbone, that is an invertebrate, would be in a completely different phylum, but it could still be an animal. It then goes into the mammal class. It's got mammary glands, basically, for feeding its young. So when a lioness has baby lions or lion cubs, they're able to feed their young using their own body that produces its own milk. Then its order is the Carnivora, so it's a meat eater. So if it was a mammal with a backbone and also an animal, but it wasn't a meat eater, it would be in a completely different order. So if it's a herbivore, for example, it would not be in the same order as the lion. Its family is the cat, so any type of cat will fall into the Felidae family. So that includes tigers, panthers, all that sort of stuff. And then its genus is the Panthera. So these are cats that roar, so ones that make a lot of noise. You've got other cats that make zero noise at all, and they're probably ones that need to rely on stealth. And then you've got the species Leo, which shows that it's a lion. So lions cannot interbreed with any other kind of cat. Well, they can actually breed with tigers and make completely different kind of organism entirely, but those babies that are produced, either tigers or ligers, I think they're called, they can't breed themselves successfully because they're not actually a species themselves. So as soon as it goes into that different species, it's now completely different. So I've got my 2 cats there. That's Lef on the left and Shemite on the right. This is a way of showing you how similar actually a house cat is to a lion. So they're in the same kingdom as a lion, animal. They're in the same phylum. They've both got backbones, as does the lion. Same mammals. They've got those mammary glands, just like the lion. So if they were to have kittens, they would be able to feed their young. They eat meat. Actually, Lef eats anything, but they generally are supposed to eat meat. They're in the same family. They're both cats as well as the lion. However, they are now into a completely different genus. They are in the Felis or Felis genus, which is a small or medium-sized cat. Whereas I don't know if you've seen a lion and its size, they are actually quite large. So my little 2 cats would not measure up at all really against the lion. So they are in a completely different genus. And they are actually obviously therefore going to be in completely different species as well. So these are now known as the Pholcus catus. That's their binomial name. So compared with the lion, the classification is completely identical up until the family, which shows they're actually fairly closely related to each other. However, the more of those subcategories that organisms match or fit into the same ones as each other, they will be more closely related. So if they're all the same groups up until genus, then they are very closely related, and there's probably only been a very recent change in its evolutionary history to create this different species. And that's something we're going to be looking at in a future topic where we talk about how evolution actually happens and how things actually do things called speciation, which is when a whole new species is designed due to having to adapt, I suppose, to new environments that are produced. So as we know, science is constantly changing. We're constantly finding new things out. We're using new technologies all the time. So due to improvements since those 1750s, when Carl Linnaeus came up with the Linnaean System, we've been able to come up with a completely different system. And this one was kind of developed by someone called Carl Woese. He designed, based particularly on things like microscopes, on more understanding of biochemical processes such as metabolism, respiration, photosynthesis, those kinds of things. We were then able to come up, well, he was able to then come up with a 3-domain system. So rather than 5 kind of main kingdoms, he's got 3 kind of sort of domains that everything falls into. So these 3 sort of categories that the system uses are archaea, bacteria, and eukaryota. So this kind of it looks a bit like this basically. So you've got the 3 different domains there across the top, and it looks a bit like the eubacteria, which is modern day bacteria, things like what gives you your common cold, for example, bacteria that lives in your guts as well. That's modern day bacteria. Then you've got the archaea, which are the archaebacteria, which are really, really old. We don't tend to see them that much. They live in really extreme conditions, so ones that maybe live in very, very hot climates or very, very high pressure conditions, ones that haven't really had to change much and adapt or evolve much. And then finally, we've got the eukarya. And I don't know if you recognise the word eukaryotes from a previous topic about cells, but you've got eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. And eukaryotic things are things like plants, animals, fungi, and protists, which you might recognise again from the 5 kingdoms, very, very similar as well. Sorry, my computer completely froze then. So how is all this information used? So we put all of this information into something called an evolutionary tree. And it helps us see how organisms are related. And it was kind of what I mentioned earlier about looking at those evolutionary changes that have created speciation and created these new species that have kind of needed to develop due to changes in the environment. So we use current classification data, and also we look at fossil data for extinct organisms, and we see if we can kind of fit them into this sort of evolutionary tree. And it kind of, one looks a bit like this. So it's the opposite way round to a family tree. Family trees, if you imagine the youngest or the most recent offspring are at the bottom of the family tree, where an evolutionary tree, the more present or the most recent kind of species are actually at the top. So those are the ones we're normally more interested in. So they're known as the species of interest. We then got the most recent or common ancestors of these sort of species that are higher up, the more present day ones, at the kind of joins of the evolutionary tree. So if you see here this orange dot, that's the most recent common ancestor of the 2 species that are on the top left of that evolutionary tree. Then if you track back down that left-hand line of the sort of V shape, there, and you see the second orange dot, that's the most recent common ancestor of all of those present-day species that are across the top there. So every time there's a branch, that shows us that an evolutionary change has happened, and we've ended up needing, we've ended up with a new species that has been created. So I want you to have a really quick go at this. If you want to number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and then you can even draw it if you prefer. See if you can use that information on in the orange box to place those names into the numbered position. So think about, this is kind of a bit confusing because I've used a family kind of idea, but I want you to think about the links and where they could go on the evolutionary tree. You want to pause the video and have a go at that. So this is the one way I came up with. There is another way, I believe, but I couldn't figure it out because this is the one way sort of I see it. So number 1 was Robert, number 2 was Patrick, number 3 I put was Sheila, and then number 4 and 5, actually I think 2 and 3 could probably go the other way around as well, thinking about it, but you need to be careful then with where you put Rosie and Tim and Keris and Becky. So Rosie and Tim always have to go together, but it doesn't matter which way around they go in that pair, and Keris and Becky, again, need to go together, but it doesn't matter which way around they go. But obviously, Keris and Becky need to come off of whichever number you put Sheila, and Rosie and Tim need to come off of whichever number you put Patrick. So you get 2 or 3. So using your evolutionary tree, I want you to have a think about who shares the most similar DNA with both Rosie and Tim, who is the most common ancestor of all the people mentioned, and which person is Becky most closely related to? Is it Rosie, Tim, or Keris? So pause the video and have a little think. So for number 1, who shares the most similar DNA with both Rosie and Tim? If we assume Rosie and Tim is number 4 and 5, you need to just track back to the first branch. In this case, I've put Patrick. So obviously, if you've done it a completely different way, that's absolutely fine, but just need to make sure that you're looking for that closest link where Rosie and Tim do actually kind of meet together at the same point. So in this example, it's Patrick. For number 2, who is the common ancestor of all of the people mentioned? Well, everyone has descended from Roberts in this case, so it's the only answer there. There's no other link that all of them have, so that's Roberts. Number 3, which person is Becky most closely related to? Is it Rosie, Tim, or Keris? Now, Becky was either number 6 or 7, it doesn't matter, and we've said, is it Rosie, Tim, or Keris? It had to be Keris because Rosie and Tim are on the complete other side of that evolutionary tree. So they actually are kind of very unrelated in comparison, but whereas Keris and Becky both evolved, if you like, from the same point, which was Sheila at number 3. So the answer would actually be Keris in that case. So have a quick think about this one. Which is the correct order for the Linnaean system? So which is the biggest group and which is the smallest group, and which way do you have to kind of put all the bits in between? So pause the video if you need to, and then make your decision. So I hope you came up with D. So it's kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So if you didn't get this right, by all means, go back, revisit this video. I've also put a link on the BBC, showing my homework entry for this lesson, to the BBC bite-size pages that are linked to this topic. So if you want to have a look through that as well, just if you want to clear anything up or see things in a different way, please feel free. So hopefully now you've got pen and paper and everything ready, and you need to have a go at the writing phase. So pause the video and give yourself plenty of time. You probably don't really need more than 20 minutes. So for the grades 1 to 2, what are the 2 different methods of grouping the organisms and why do we do it? Why is it useful for us to do that? For grades 3 to 4, how are organisms usually grouped? So what is it that we actually kind of consider when we put organisms into these groups? For grades 5 and 6, can you describe the 2 systems? So what does the Linnaean system use? What does the 3-domain classification system use? And then for grades 7 to 9, can you explain what an evolutionary tree tells us? So pause the video, make sure you're using full sentences and all that sort of stuff, and then I will show you the answers in a moment for you to compare them with. So you might want to get a green pen if you've got one, obviously, but if you haven't got a green pen, any other colour would be useful so you can see where you've made improvements. Make sure you tick it. if it's right, obviously, and correct it, add detail, and make sure it's your best work so that you've actually got something decent to learn from in the future. So for grades 1 to 2, what are the two methods of grouping organisms and why is it useful? Two methods of classifying organisms are the Linnaean and three-domain systems, and it's useful so that we can actually identify organisms really easily across the world. For grades 3 to 4, organisms are usually based on their observable features, so what we can look at. However, obviously with the three-domain system, we've gone a little bit further, haven't we, because we've got this more modern technology. For grades 5 to 6, describing the two systems, we've got the Linnaean system was by Carl Linnaeus. Actually, I just need to think about what the spelling did there. And it uses 5 kingdoms, breaks them down into smaller categories, and I've just listed them to make sure they stay at the forefront of my mind. Then the three-domain system was developed by Carl Rose, and it's got 3 categories only, the Archaeobacteria and Eukaryota. For grades 7 to 9, we needed to explain what evolutionary trees tell us. So I've put that evolutionary trees tell us where present-day species have evolved from now extinct ancestors, and they help us see how closely related different species are. Obviously, if you put more detail than that, excellent. What I've given you there is the absolute bare minimum and some sort of key vocabulary that you should have included. If you haven't included some of those keywords, things like ancestor, for example, in the grade 7 to 9, or observable features for grades 3 to 4, it might be useful to kind of add those in with your different colour pen. So decide where you got up to. So where did you achieve today? And make sure you write today I achieved and then the word. So today I achieved describe, explain, use or create. And then because I could, and then choose the white box that goes with that colour. Pause the video if you need to, by the way. And don't forget, I'd like to see how you're getting on the topics. So there's a 10-question quiz on Show My Homework. Make sure you complete that so we can see how you're getting on. You do get 3 attempts. There's no punishment if you don't do very well on it. It's more just so we can see how you're getting on, so that we can kind of work out if we need to do any extra work on these topics when we do go back to school. I hope this was useful, and I'll see you later this week. We've got 2 more lessons this week. We've got about 3 weeks together, I think, on this topic, and then I can't remember who's moving you on. But anyway, I'll see you for the next lesson later.